Heather has held an impressive array of leadership positions, including currently being the section head of global programs at the Zoological Society of London, and before that, the curator of the London Zoo Aquarium. She obtained her BSc in Marine and Fish Sciences at the University of Plymouth, and a PhD actually working on salmonids, which a lot of you here will be happy to know, from the University College Swansea and University College London. Amongst her many accomplishments, in 1996 she co-founded Project Seahorse, which is the world's leading authority on research into seahorses. She's published numerous papers on seahorse biology, conservation, and even seahorse aquaculture. Also, she has developed a company called Networks, I'm sure she'll be talking about that, that turns discarded fishing nets into carpet tiles. So both reducing pollution and increasing employment in poor communities. Amongst many other things, she has an amazing partnership with the, I would say, high-end store Selfridges in London, where they developed a communications advertising campaign to make people more aware of ocean issues and to change purchasing habits. Right now, Heather has active projects in the following countries: the UK, Philippines, Bangladesh, Cameroon, Mozambique, Nepal, Portugal, Sri Lanka, the Chagos Archipelago, and the Pitcairn Islands. So I guess it's pretty much amazing that she made time to come and speak to us. So I would hand over now, and thank you very much for coming.
Thanks very much. This is my first time in Seattle, and I'm really delighted to be here, and I've already had a really interesting and engaging day with a number of you. The talk I want to give today, I think, having looked at some of the other lectures in the series, touches on quite a lot of the topics that have been covered already, and I hope adds my perspective to an already very interesting set of perspectives presented. And I want to talk particularly from this perspective of looking at solutions in marine conservation and finding reasons for optimism. When I looked at setting out this talk, I looked at who I should put as co-authors. And then I realized I was really covering quite a wide array of topics. And I realized how many people that I've collaborated with over the years, both people and organizations, team members from the Project Seahorse team and onwards. And that's really been one of the themes of this talk is about the importance of collaboration. None of these issues can be solved by a single individual or even a small team. So looking outwards and finding collaborations is particularly important. It is a pretty wide-ranging talk, so partly for me and also for you, there are some themes, honest, that run through the whole thing. And those beyond collaboration are obviously around marine conservation, science, finding solutions, innovative ones at that, looking at how we communicate, and then particularly once we find these solutions, how do we scale them, how do we replicate them, and how resilient are they? But I want to start with a more philosophical question, I guess, is that how do you feel about the state of the ocean? You're all clever scientists studying issues around the aquatic environment, but how do you feel when you think about the ocean? I think some of you may be putting yourself in the category of the poor blobfish. And you're not alone. In fact, there's a paper that first articulated this issue in 2010, which contended that there's a continuing culture of hopelessness among conservation biologists. Those who really should be at the forefront of finding solutions are feeling the most hopeless. And part of that reason is, for many scientists, the changes that we see have happened within our lifetimes, whether that's plastic pollution, whether that's changing in fisheries, changes in habitats, and changes to our own environment and the places where we grew up. These changes have been quite dramatic and relatively swift. And it's not just the conservation biologists or conservation scientists. There's growing evidence that children and adults feel overwhelmed and hopeless about the state of the environment. And that's been given various names, from ecophobia to talking about environmental grief, an environmental apathy. People are generally overwhelmed with what's happening and don't know how to deal with it and find it an extremely challenging situation. As a woman involved in the environment, I found this paper particularly helpful. This is really the unintended consequences, is the people who are really at the forefront of trying to make change actually have very negative stereotypes, and people have quite a different view and this sort of backlash about what those individuals, such as myself, are trying to achieve. So maybe it's a case of looking at the scenarios that we have in front of us and looking at what kind of future we want to achieve, and then what steps are required to achieve that. So think now, how do you see the future of the ocean? What does it look like to you? Whatever mathematical model or whatever other study that you're doing, what does the ocean look like to you in the future? Is it this vibrant, biodiverse state? Is it this, which is a real life scenario, but also the projection for many coral reefs? Is it what's happening, coastal development, human population, very artificial situation? Or are we in a more extreme situation of looking at the future of the ocean? And while Googling for this image, I found an extraordinary number of architects who are actually working on designing underwater cities. So, what are our options? Well, there's a couple. Hide in a cupboard or head in the hands. So I'd like to suggest something a little bit different as an alternative strategy. And that's to look at ocean optimism and to be a little bit more positive about the scenarios that are there and look at how we can reach a more positive future for the oceans. I'm not alone in this thinking, and I know that Nancy Knowlton from the Smithsonian spoke here quite recently, and her perspective came from training graduate students, as she put it, to write ever more detailed obituaries about the environment. And also looking that the number of students registering for courses in conservation is actually declining. So this isn't a good situation in an academic sense. And Nancy's feeling was that we need to move beyond the obituaries to look at how we can look at solid peer-reviewed solutions and scale those up. Another colleague, Dr. Ellen Kelsey, was looking at it particularly from the point of view of children. So we're dealing with the current scenario now and the concerns that we have, but what about the generation that's inheriting what we have done, and what do kids feel about that? And from me, as a conservationist working in a couple of countries around the world, I see the same mistakes being made again and again, but I also see some amazing things happening on the ground and real changes for good, often at a grassroots level. But how will this fisher in Cameroon ever know that what he's doing could be directly relevant to what these guys in the Philippines are doing, or these guys, that's 3/4 of the population of the Pitcairn Islands, of what they're doing in their place? And unless it's physical movement, how do we share these solutions? So there's lots of amazing things going on, but how do we share that information and understand what is replicable and scalable in those different places? Now, what you find if you're optimistic is quite interesting. You clearly don't know what's going on. You're naive or ignorant or extremely stubborn. I'm probably a bit of many of those, but I think it really comes down to how we choose to present information. And if you look at the medical industry, in 2012, 8.2 million people died from cancer. Yet the way cancer is presented in the media is very much solutions focused. How do you, a new hope for a cancer cure? We talk about cancer survivors. We even talk about carrots fighting cancer. That's a British newspaper for you. But it's cancer breakthroughs and we will beat cancer. So it's very much a major global medical issue that's presented in a solutions focused way. So we need to look on the bright side, and this was discussed in a New Scientist article based on a peer-reviewed paper by Bill Lawrence and his team. But how do we balance that with what the actual science is telling us and the various scenarios relating to climate change and other issues which are really suggesting that the ocean is in crisis point from a number of different disciplines. And that's how the media chooses to present issues around the ocean. So if you look at environmental communication on the whole in the media, it's doom and gloom. It's very negative. It's around disasters, catastrophes. We're ruining the planet. The world's oceans are in a shocking decline. And what we need to do is not be naive, ignorant, or otherwise, but to look at how we can balance that narrative into something that's more realistic of what the real state is that while there are problems, there are also solutions. So a very small group of us with no budget came up with a hashtag as an idea of how we could do something that was global, accessible, and how we might share something. It also has no logos associated with it. So the design is just to try and see how we can share solutions more effectively using a social media platform of Twitter. So we launched it on World Oceans Day last year with a bunch of tweets from us. And what was encouraging and has continued to happen over the last 8 months monitoring that is not only is there an ongoing conversation around optimism and an ongoing sharing of these stories, but there's also contributors to that I have never had a single connection with in my life, as have a number of the people who came up with this hashtag in the first place. So we're actually achieving something which is a social media conversation around solutions with particular stories, a number of which are backed up by peer-reviewed science, which are shared across those platforms and around the world. So it's an interesting start, and it's an interesting way to think. And we do need to change the way we communicate. And as Trevor mentioned in the introduction, one of those is a partnership, and one example of these is a partnership that I've had with Selfridges department store, which is a very high-end luxury department store, the best department store in the world, which happens to be located in the busiest high street in the world in Oxford Street in London. Now, if you think of high-end luxury and fashion, you probably have some immediate stereotypes in your mind. Well, it turns out that that community also has some immediate stereotypes in their mind about the science community. And when we first talked to Selfridges, they said, well, you guys are pretty dull. You don't know how to communicate. You're boring. And you only identify problems and not solutions. So we said, well, you know how to set trends. You know how to influence markets. And you certainly know how to communicate. So how do we go about it? I'd first like to say that they could be right. This is quite a controversial paper, but I think it makes an interesting point of discussion. And the main point of that is really that peer-reviewed scientific papers are not reaching the mass public, and they're not going to be our primary mechanism of making change to a wider audience than our peers. So this is really heartening for anybody in the middle of publishing a paper right now. So that we need to look at a currency beyond the peer-reviewed journal publication if we want to communicate our messages more broadly. The answer clearly is in semi-naked models, in plankton-esque balloon models. Well, this was Selfridges' interpretation of how we might get people engaged in marine conservation. So here's me stepping out of my comfort zone very, very quickly. But what we achieved was a way of reaching an audience that had to deal with people going on a bus past the store and looking out of the window for 3 seconds. So this posed an interesting question. This is out of context of any ocean environment. And we also looked at their windows, which are very well known for their creative engagement. And we were asked about all of the different issues we wanted to cover, and we talked about endangered species. So this is southern bluefin tuna, critically endangered on the IUCN Red List, swimming next to a Plander only endangered on a IUCN Red List. But an icon for many people of conservation and a way of starting to have a conversation about fish being wildlife too. We also were able to reach new audiences. This is Prince Charles to Lady Gaga's lobster hat, and achieved media coverage just through association with Selfridges and a completely new set of media. So the fashion media, the arts media, the business media, so not just the environmental journalists that we're always talking to. For the graduate students this morning, here is the bucking bronco whale that was used to fundraise as a fundraiser and a way of pulling together a crowd that you can then have a conversation with about marine conservation. In 2011, when we launched Project Ocean, Selfridges also took some steps themselves. They switched to entirely sustainable seafood and insisted on it from every franchise that was in the store, which included a sushi chain that then subsequently changed their seafood acquisition policy across the entire chain. In 2013, we worked with them on the changing the image of sharks, and as their action, they worked with all of their beauty suppliers and over 500 product lines to make sure there was no shark-based squalene used in their beauty products, and eliminated all of that. And in 2015, we're tackling the tiny issue of marine debris, so watch this space for more information on that. So it's a very glossy, very funky, very creative campaign, but what do we actually do? Well, we reached a lot of people. What did we do with that? That's another question. But this was about engaging new audiences, people who'd never thought about our world ever. And that's what we were able to do through pulling together the audience that Selfridges had to have these new conversations. We achieved really widespread media, and Selfridges launched something called retail activism, which has become a term now in the retail community about making positive behavior change and influencing their suppliers and their consumer buying habits. And they raised funds through things like the bucking whale and other things to support marine protected areas. One of my greatest joys of this particular program, which Selfridges was genuinely surprised about, was we got 23 marine conservation NGOs, all on the same message, talking about sustainable seafood and future for fisheries, alongside the importance of marine reserves. And that was a great collaboration to have that consistency of message. And out of that, 5 of the NGOs got together on an informal but a more long-term basis and developed the Marine Reserves Coalition, which was designed to communicate the science of marine reserves and look at how we can increase marine protection. Now, one of those organizations is Pew, which I'm sure you're all familiar with the Global Ocean Legacy Program. And many of these sites that they've identified as potential large-scale marine reserves are actually also the remnants of the British colony and the UK overseas territories, so very small pieces of land with very large areas of ocean. And one of the initiatives around these kind of campaigns that's been a key part of the Global Ocean Legacy has been finding the right political timing to also discuss this kind of ocean protection. And we're currently coming up in April to a British election, and we have a pre-election campaign that relates to 3 of the sites in the UK overseas territories. And those are Pitcairn in the Pacific, South Georgia and South Sandwich Islands in the Southern Ocean, and Ascension in the Atlantic Ocean. So we're working, my experience is particularly with Pitcairn, which I'll talk about later. But one of the vulnerabilities of such campaigns is you get the great political shebang, and then how do you actually make that reserve work? So that's one of the roles that we've really stepped in on with a number of collaborators as the Zoological Society of London. We started in 1826, so we kind of are around for the long haul. And the work that I want to talk about in that sense is our work in the Chagos Archipelago, which is another UK overseas territory right in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Now, the Chagos Archipelago is 640,000 square kilometers of ocean. That's a no-take marine reserve. And it's as near pristine as you can get in the ocean today. So it has extremely abundant and diverse species and fantastic coral cover. And we still know really very little about it. So anything deeper than about 30 meters is pretty much unexplored, but the entire area has never been trawled. And we know from bathymetry that it has very interesting deep sea vents, abyssal plains, and multiple seamounts. And even shallow water habitats like these seagrasses, that entire ecosystem was only discovered to exist in Chagos in 2010. And this is me fortunate to do the first ever dive on that habitat in 2012. And similarly, mangroves were found on 2 of the islands, again, only in 2010. So there's a huge amount of basic documentation and work to be done. As all of our oceans, even if it is very effectively protected and there's no other pressures from pollution or fishing, it's vulnerable to the wider issues facing our oceans in terms of sea surface temperature rises and ocean acidification. And this is what happened in Chagos in 1998. But just a few years later, this is in 2006, the corals had recovered, and my collaborator, Charles Shepherd from Warwick University, has documented this recovery over time and really showed that if you remove those other stressors like pollution, then you end up with a system that's far more resilient and able to recover. And that's what we're seeing in Chagos. But it does highlight the value of long-term monitoring. We are continuing to go back to the same sites to monitor temperatures and to do videography to actually assess what's happening in what can be considered a really important reference sites, because you have removed so many of the other variables that we deal with in other parts of our ocean. There's a lot of fish in Chagos. And another collaborator, Nick Graham from James Cook University, has been doing some assessments on those as part of a wider study using the same methodology right the way across the Indian Ocean, looking at fished and unfished sites. He had to recalibrate his axes to look at the reef fish biomass by trophic level in Chagos. And the 3-meter site is very much in the surge zone, so it's a very aggressive, high energy habitat. So this underpins what we talk about in terms of shifting baselines and understanding what reference sites look like. What's also really interesting about the work in Chagos is it's shown that the fish behave quite differently, and you can swim an awful lot closer to fish in Chagos that are very naive because they've never really been fished. One of the most controversial things about setting this up as a no-take marine reserve was this involved the closure of a tuna fishery, a longline and purseine fishery that was actually funding the patrol vessel at the time. So it was a big decision for the government to close down that funding stream that came in from the tuna fishery and to look at other funding sources to support enforcement within the reserve. So one of the key questions that came out of that, and is obviously being looked at across the literature, is how do these large marine protected areas work for mobile species? And how effective are they? And is this large-scale protection, what's it actually doing for the tunas and the sharks and the mobile species? And there was, of course, no data from Chagos at all. So in response to that, we have been developing a research program to look at trying to fill the gaps and answer those questions. So one of the most obvious methods, although it's obviously quite expensive and logistically challenging, is to tag big mobile fish and look at where they move. And in collaboration with Stanford University, they've been conducting some tagging, and there's further tagging planned for later this year. We've also been looking at established methods, so using baited remote underwater videography to document fish populations, but obviously that's primarily reef-associated species, but it does provide access to depths beyond the diver depths, which you can do. There's no decompression facilities or infrastructure, so we have to operate very safe diving practices there. And there's further surveys underway right now. So that's really looking at how we can measure diversity and abundance as a relative index over time. But the question was, how do we look at, if we are going to monitor what happens in that big blue zone, how do we do that without doing a scientific fishing in a no-take marine reserve? And what's the methodology should we develop? So I spent quite a lot of time talking to terrestrial colleagues, and again in a collaboration with the University of Western Australia, we came up with the concept of camera trapping and using the same as baited remote underwater videography, but making it float. So what we do is basically long line with cameras instead of hooks. We bait them, so it's the same influence, and this has been led by the University of Western Australia colleagues, but it gives us a way of monitoring in the open ocean and documenting both biodiversity, abundance, and because it's deployed in a stereo regime, we can also look at length. What we've found with some technical development and modification, it is a low cost and provides a standardized sampling methodology that does give us many of the species that were previously associated with the fishery there. And since we started this and trialed it off Australia, we've then used it in Chagos, New Caledonia, and this is the UWA team in Palau and New Caledonia. And then this year, for the first time, in the second only pelagic-focused expedition to Chagos, we were able to work with a number of other organizations, universities, to start to build a bigger picture of what's happening there and how a mix of potential aggregation devices like seamounts, looking at the fisheries data, historic fisheries data, looking at tagging data and looking at videography can start to build up a picture of what's happening with these mobile species, as well as looking at the environmental predictors of what's happening. So this is early work. It was the expedition was completed in January, so data analysis is underway now. But these methodologies also are most useful if they're applied in a way that can be scaled across sites. And so the Pitcairn Island proposed marine reserve in the middle of the Pacific also offers an opportunity for further sampling using the same methods. And so here we've used the baited remote underwater video, and we hope in the future we'll be able to employ the mid-water camera sampling regime as well. The logistics of getting to Pitcairn make Chagos look like it's on a metro line. You can get a boat 4 times a year, and you can stay for 10 days or 3 months. So this is a very noble master student who was left on Pitcairn to complete his research and submit remotely. But the big challenge is, this is one of the uninhabited Pitcairn Islands, is that although these remote, pristine, amazing places in the ocean are really important, a lot of our ocean looks very different. And in a lot of places, we're not looking at biodiversity, wildlife, we're looking at food security and natural resources, and the real interface between people and the environment. And this has really been the other strand of work that I've been involved with for a long time. And the thing that's underpinning this, and this is not the wildlife equivalent of the balloon models, I promise you, but it is the flagship species for addressing this issue for me for many years has been working on seahorses and co-founding Project Seahorse with Amanda Vincent in 1996. So why they're important and they provide an interesting flagship is they do live in the most vulnerable coastal marine habitats. There is a significant global trade, particularly for traditional medicine, aquarium trade, and for souvenirs and curiosities. And there's also a very high bycatch, particularly from shrimp trawl fisheries. So very small numbers, but lots and lots of trawls, equating to a very large trade. And seahorses, as a woman on the positive side, because they have pregnant males, provide a very interesting entry point for community discussions with women who have an average family size of 7 children. There's a great enthusiasm to work with seahorses where the male is always pregnant. So our work early on set around in a completely data absent environment, was actually using fishers' knowledge and community-based social methods to document what had happened with the fishery, And I don't have the associated statistics with that here to hand, but this is illustrative of what the community perceptions of change were. And then we also worked with the communities to look at what solutions would be appropriate and acceptable to implement at that community level. And what was interesting is one of the very acceptable management regimes was seen to be spatial management around community-managed marine protected areas. So that was based on where the community felt they should go, and that was often the sites where they were most depleted, but they felt that that was going to be a good place and an opportunity for recovery. So often in these communities, they describe marine protected areas as banks for the future. So in '96, we started in Danahan Bank. So we have, which is a unique double barrier reef in the center of the Philippines. And since then have facilitated the establishment of 34 community-managed no-take marine protected areas. We've done associated science as we've gone, so we monitor the marine protected areas inside, outside, and at control sites. So we have a substantial database of which now represents 18 years of continual monitoring of these reserves. And the results of those have found that even the small reserves can increase abundance of the most valuable species. But enforcement is the critical factor. But some social research has been particularly interesting to show that benefits are beyond the ecological benefits or fisheries benefits that you might be seeking. That the associated organization and engagement of communications around the process of establishing and managing a marine protected area lead to other social capital benefits, such as trust, social cohesion, and really bring the community together around that particular management regime. So what we've really taken as our philosophy here is two quotes. One I've pulled out from Johannes, and another that Amanda Vincent gave at the IMCC meeting last year, is that these are not situations where we have data, where we can deal with working with those data, but it's dealing with making the best decisions of information at that time and then working hard to fill those data gaps as best we possibly can. So the ultimate adaptive management model. And we've used that whether it's related to our policy work with CITES, our trade surveys, or with establishing marine protected areas. And what was interesting was to go back retrospectively to look at those marine protected areas and found that the ecological coverage was actually pretty good, even though they were placed initially not on any Mark-Sand model, but on the fisher's choice or the community choice. And as always, what we're facing is being incredibly resource limited. And although seahorses are extremely iconic, and we talk about them a lot, there's actually very few of us working on them globally. Some of them in this room, which is great to see. And most seahorse species on the IUCN Red List are considered data deficient. So we've employed a great emerging tool, and a real benefit to science that we now discuss in many platforms is using citizen science. So we have the combination of a website and app on a program called iSeahorse. And it's basically a way of harnessing the enthusiasm for seahorses from the dive community and beyond to report seahorse sightings where they see them and start to fill in these data gaps. We've also working on a pilot basis in the Philippines to test the use of SMS messaging from mobile phones in communities which do have mobile phone technology but often lack smartphones or websites. And this is the iSeahorse Philippines team doing the seahorse sign, which you all need to practice. It works out of water as well. And what they've been doing is engaging interested communities, documenting, and then providing training. So the training is also to look at the next stage of iSeahorse, which is how we can document trends in seahorse population times through repeat monitoring, which can be as little as once a year, or it could be on a monthly basis for an enthusiastic dive club or university research group or whatever. So the point is that we're providing standard methodologies, we're providing it online, and we're providing a platform to enter those data. The next step, of course, is what do you do with those data? That's amazing to have interest and engagement, and we have sightings coming in from all over the world, and we're really filling in gaps and finding new observations all the time, including just in the last 18 months, we have 3 new species reported from the Philippines, which are range extensions, but really exciting, entirely down to citizen science. And those communities who've been involved in sighting these new seahorses have become so excited about that they're now looking at setting up protected areas or protection measures for seahorses in these sites. And that's the ultimate goal, is to use the data to inform policy and management. But protected areas around the world show very uneven habitat representation. And in many sites like the Philippines, the focus has been on the perceived high-value sites, particularly coral reefs. But in the same place, this incredible center of rich biodiversity, we've also important coastal habitats like mangroves, where half of the mangroves has been lost since the 1960s, primarily in a transformation to make fish ponds to address that issue of food security. So in another program that we started 8 years ago, we've started to look specifically as how we deal with mangroves, which are not proper forests and not proper ocean, and therefore fall between a lot of the policy and management gaps or management capabilities. And our strategy has been quite simple: protect what's left, look at how we can expand mangrove areas through replanting, maintain mangrove biodiversity through science-based replanting schemes. The image on the left is a well-meaning but monoculture plantation of one species in a country where there's 35 mangrove species. And use science-based methods that are simply translated to become relevant for communities. So we've worked a lot on manuals, on simple tools, even people knowing what the laws are in the Philippines around mangroves, tide tables of when you can actually plant mangroves that's going to be successful. And as a fish biologist, I really got into trees when I realized that they don't swim away, and you don't have to go away and do lots of statistics to see recovery. You can go back to the same site and the same trees are there, bigger. So it's quite exciting. And so this is some of the sites that we've worked in. We do have the statistics behind this to show that it is significant. So that's the sort of seafront planting, which is where the focus of a lot of mangrove planting efforts have been. But what do we do with these fish ponds? Because a number of these have become unproductive over time due to disease or whatever, this is mainly for milkfish or shrimp, you find large areas of abandoned ponds. And we wanted to do some documentation to find out about how we could go about reverting these fish ponds back to mangroves, which is required by Philippines law. So in a very systematic approach by some of our team, we used a combination of satellite imagery and painstaking paperwork from every government office across an entire province. We did some ground truthing, but had to be careful because there were security issues about telling people that they might have to give up their ponds. And all you need to know from this graph is anything that is white, pink, or pink is illegal and shouldn't be a pond at all. The yellow ones, some of them, about half of them are also illegal, and the blue ones may also be illegal. So basically about, so yeah, actually they're all, so most of these ponds shouldn't be there. So we are now having to work at a national policy level with the Department of the Environment and the Department of Fisheries and Agriculture to look at how we can implement Philippines law and look at where these ponds are actually providing food security and functioning and where they're abandoned and should be reverted to mangroves. So in a parallel process, we've actually been working on the mechanics of fish pond reversion, which involves biophysical changes and looking at natural recovery with assisted planting. And this is one of our sites, which I went back to just 3 weeks ago, and has now been entirely run by the local government. And this muddy pond where nobody went that was abandoned has now been converted into a mangrove eco-park, which was about as rewarding as you can get as a practical conservationist. And this is Wilson, who's really led the drive for that. So bringing these together, what we've tried to do is then look at how we can encompass mangroves into marine protected areas. And what we've done is working in now 6 sites, is looked at whether we can increase both the diversity of habitats protected, provide ecological connectivity between those habitats, and increase the area that's being well managed and protected. And what we've found is that that's very acceptable at a community level. So the valuable fishery sites are seen to be the reefs. There's less interest or less concern about expanding protection to include seagrasses and mangroves. And you can see here just from the baseline areas of protection, and this has been a 2-year program looking at expanding these areas, and we now have 6 sites that have really shown significant expansion. So this is really quite encouraging. So it's all going well so far. October 2013, a 7.2 magnitude earthquake hit half of our sites where we've been working for, including a team who were doing underwater surveys at the time, hit Bohol and Cebu, and that's bigger than the Christchurch earthquake, which was a pretty horrific experience and destroyed many homes and lives. 3 weeks later, you probably all heard in the news, so November the 8th, 2013, Typhoon Haiyan hit the rest of our sites, which was extraordinary experience I never want to repeat, and really tests what you do as somebody working on practical conservation issues and as a scientist. Haiyan, as you probably know, was the strongest storm ever to make landfall. The red squares are people, a massive storm surge, a massive, massive storm, and talking to people who lived through it, unbelievably terrifying, and obviously killed thousands and thousands of people and destroyed infrastructure, homes, and everything. Well, the answer is you actually turn yourself into an aid organization. We were able to mobilize a lot of help and support, and it became very obvious that our many years of experience working in the area were very precious at that time in knowing, and in a number of our sites, the ZSL or Project Seahorse team were the first people to reach those communities, and we were the first people they called from help because we've been working with them for many years. What was also really interesting is the community structures that we'd established around mangrove conservation or marine protected area management became the focal points for organizing those communities and making aid distribution organized and fair. So what you can see here is highly organized distribution of what was, who needed what and when. Everything was documented and archived. Everything is really organized. And then this picture here is to remind me that this amazing old woman who was one of the people who looked after one of the mangrove nurseries, even though this was her house after Typhoon Haiyan, continued to monitor the mangrove nurseries and look after them, partly because the sense of norm of doing something that you're meant to do around the devastation that was all around. The changes to our long-term monitoring sites were also quite interesting. The earthquake is having snorkeled across those sites, and this is the team diving, and we organized as quickly as safely possible. And if anybody knows of any dive guidelines around what's safe to dive after earthquakes, please let me know. Because there's a lot of bubbling and shifting and movement going on. But we basically resurveyed all of our sites and tracked what had happened and the shifts and changes. And some of these sites that were at 6 meters are now got 30-meter drop-offs. Some of our 9-meter transects are now at 25 meters, which has offered some interesting questions about what we do as the next steps in terms of our monitoring program. Mangroves look pretty devastated. We got teams on the ground in the month after Typhoon Haiyan to do some rapid assessments of damage and work out what had happened in collaboration with the University of the Philippines Tacloban. Just as a side point, UP Tacloban had organized the Philippine Association of Marine Science Conference. One happens once every 2 years. the biggest conference in the Philippines. You all know what conference organizations are like. The week after that, Haiyan hit them. And the week after that, Marge de la Cruz was out on the ground with our team doing mangrove assessments. Absolutely extraordinary response in terms of documenting what was going on. So this looks pretty devastated, and satellite data after the Haiyan show, it really was spectacularly, looked really destroyed. 3 months later, it looks like this. These are these same sites. And what we do see is a real recovery of the mangroves. And what we did was this rapid deployment of teams and pulling together the data, sharing it in a workshop. And just in a brief summary, what we've found overall is that where you have the monoculture plantations, you have about 30% of them are destroyed. Where you have natural stands of mangrove forests with all the biodiversity and those stands are mature, then you have very, very minimal damage. So these are naturally resilient systems. So if they're there, then they do their job. A big part of what's come out of that is a huge national interest in mangroves, and we're now working with communities in terms of how to manage their mangrove forests and respond to that through training programs. And we involve a lot of youth in those training programs, and one of the benefits of that is the enthusiasm and numbers you get through that. From a communication point of view, at the end of the day, they go home and share their muddy mangrove pictures with their friends on Facebook. So just to deal with one of the things I haven't really grappled, and the final part of this talk relates to one of the biggest challenges we face in these developing countries where there are opportunity costs related to marine conservation. So although mangrove forest recovers relatively quickly and we see marine protected areas, these are still long time frames in the lives of people who are dealing with daily struggles for survival. These are people at the very front line of survival, and in terms of fisheries, they'll eat anything and everything. If it takes 8 hours to catch one fish, then that's what they'll do. And in some of these communities, they're even eating soft corals because the situation has got so desperate. So how do we tackle this, making conservation pro-poor? How do we deal with this time lag in terms of these ecological responses? Well, let's not reinvent the wheel. There's lots of organizations already engaged with poverty alleviation and development. So one of the initiatives we've taken is to look across these situations to what durable community institutions. And we've come up with these community banks or village savings and loan associations, which is a globally implemented initiative. It's been monitored by the Bill Gates Foundation. Uniquely, after 1 year of training and establishment, if you go back 5 years later, over 95% of these community banks are still running exactly the same. It's a small-scale savings within the community. There's no external agent, there's no external funding. The only capital involved is the cost of this box and the training. Second ingredient is novel partners. And we've teamed up with Interface, which is the largest carpet tile manufacturer in the world, who you probably haven't heard of because I hadn't. Well, you might have, you might know more than me. But basically, they have an incredibly ambitious sustainability plan to eliminate their dependence on oil by 2020. But their supply chain challenge for looking at how they move beyond pure oil is to look at where they're going to get it from instead. And the match we found was through fishing nets, particularly monofilament fishing nets, which is a global issue in very large numbers. So what we've set up is a really interesting partnership with Interface, the carpet tile manufacturer, with ZSL as a conservation organization, and with Aquafil, which is based in Slovenia, which has the only technology at the moment to recycle nylon 6 into which is what these fishing nets are made of, into yarn. So how does it work? Well, basically, communities collect discarded fishing nets that they find on the beaches or in the sea. They get an income from those nets, a price per kilo, that are coordinated by the community banks. They send them to a collection point. They get baled, exported to Slovenia, and turned into carpet. So this is really what we're looking at for the future, is an inclusive business model that deals with the community, so the social aspects, the environment, and business, and it sustains itself. This entire model is entirely self-financing. It doesn't require philanthropy. It doesn't require external support. And in the last 18 months of this program, this is what we've collected. I don't know what unit you work in, but 56 metric tons of discarded fishing nets. We're working at about 3.3 metric tons a month at the moment. And that's provided additional supplemental income to 4,500 villagers in 14 collection sites in the Philippines. We have a third collection hub underway in the Philippines, and we're also trialing replicating this model in Cameroon. And we're also having a lot of conversations with people who've seen an awful lot of nets piled up on beaches in different parts of the world to see how we can scale and replicate this model. So I want to finish with a very short film that explains that a lot better than I just did. But really to use this example to capture really what this talk, I hope, has been all about, which is firstly the value of looking at solutions-based approaches, making sure that science informs those decisions, looking at novel partners that innovate, and an interdisciplinary approach, and seeing how resilient that system is, even though I wouldn't recommend testing it with typhoons and earthquakes.
Networks is a program that Interface has developed with the Zoological Society of London and our other partner, Africa, who is the private supplier to Interface. The program takes discarded fishing nets from coastal communities and arranges the recycling of those fishing nets back into carpet fibre that we can use in our modular flooring.
What we're doing with Networks is creating a new, innovative and practical example of an inclusive business model. Groups from the communities go out into the environment and collect nets off the beaches and from the sea, and they get nets from fitters at the end of life to prevent them from getting confined in the first place. As a group, the community then sell the nets into a global supply chain, and they are regenerated into nylon yarn that can then be used to make some very beautiful products such as Interface's carpet tiles. What we want to do with Networks is ensure that as much of the value of the nets is retained within the community in order for the community to benefit as much as possible.
I always believe that you can do business at the same time contributing for very serious objectives like cleaning the oceans or marine debris. So it's not a charity. This is an enterprise, a social enterprise. Developing inclusive business is not about philanthropic giving. We're doing this to demonstrate that there is a better way of doing business. Even with a very devastated situation, people were not hopeless.
We have a strong spirit. We believe in, we call it bayanihan. It's how we volunteered ourselves if one member of the community needed our help.
The resilience of the people in the Philippines has been amazing. The infrastructure that we've designed for taking fishing nets out of the villages, they reverse so that they could use to bring aid into the villages.
One of the things I find really interesting over the last year is seeing the way that the people are responding to the program. What we expected to find after the earthquake was that the volume of nets being collected would reduce as people's priorities changed and they focus on trying to rebuild. But what we actually found is that in some communities, net collection actually appeared to increase. So some people were turning to nets as a way of supplementing their livelihoods during that period.
The success for me for the Networks program, having now established that the initial program is viable, is to expand that beyond. to also influence the broader manufacturing community to explore inclusive business opportunities in their supply chain.
It's a huge achievement to have got to where we've got to, and to be able to sit here today and look around at all the huge quantity of nets that are here and realise the amount of work that's actually gone into that. I think it's been success.
Thank you. Hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you have any concerns about that, and how you maintain the interest of the masses to follow how funds, for example, are being used to recover those systems, and to apply those funds to research and not just some other.
I think, I mean, just to be clear, I'm not looking at a solely optimistic narrative. I'm looking at a balanced narrative. So I think there is important not to be in denial of disasters like that and the impacts that they have on the environment, but also to make sure that we also have space to talk about solutions and changes. And what was interesting in the Philippines situation is that the mangroves, we had a situation where the government wanted to pay a cash to work scheme to help people in a very disastrous situation to cut down the dead mangroves, to then pay them again to plant new mangroves in a cash for work scheme to help their recovery. As scientists, it was very difficult for us to say the mangroves can do this themselves. You don't need to do anything, because people are looking for action and response in that kind of situation and being, trying to help people. I think it's different ways of communication. I hope in this talk, from the crazy work we've done with Selfridges in terms of novel communication through to a nice film clip at the end, it's the different ways that we tell stories, and there are different ways that we communicate. So whether it's, I'm not, I think, Twitter is one medium, film is another, media is another, scientific fora, conservation meetings are another. It's just we can't get stuck on one. And if you look in the environmental media is a tiny part of all media, and the good news component of what's talked about of the environment is a very, very, very tiny proportion of that. So an indicator of success for me, being British, would be to look on the BBC News website every morning, look under the science and environment section and see one good news story amongst the 8, however many they have each day. So I think it's that balance that we're missing, and it's also providing those solutions and sharing those solutions to know what can be done, because I think it's the switch off that you get with people who are like, well, it's hopeless anyway. we can't do anything. It's too big. It's all, it's all politics. It's all climate change. It's all, it's all beyond the individual action. And the reason why I think I've got involved in such a diverse range of projects is because of trying to seek different ways to tackle solutions that you can, there's no one way to do things. Sometimes it's a policy intervention. Sometimes it's, somebody with a placard on the street. There's different times where the different interventions are right, but we have to understand what works and how to implement those more effectively. And we're not very good at it on the whole. We tend to talk to ourselves, and we tend to talk about the same things, and we tend, as scientists, to be critical. We're always looking for what's wrong with this. It's the analytical side of us, so we want to pick holes in it. We want to identify what's wrong with it. Is that, that's what you're trained to do. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing that, but it's doing it in a ways of when we find something that's reasonably robust, then that's the thing that we should be shouting from the rooftops in multiple different ways.
Yeah, that was an excellent talk, and one of those things that motivates those of us who try to solve problems. I really like the heuristic, I guess, of your curve that showed costs and benefits. I think, as from a conservation point of view, we tend to forget that the transient is actually the thing people live through. We have this utopia that we'll have, if you wait 20 years, everything we find, you just have to starve for 20 years. So
Yeah.
great to see that focus. Do you have any evidence? Do you know where that break point is? Do you have enough data in your examples in Cameroon, Philippines, or wherever to give an idea of essentially how much of that community support, and I really support the idea of non-sort of philanthropic solutions. How long does it take to that? Have you seen that break point? Do we know when we've sort of got to the point where the community is benefiting from the conservation?
I think, so the Networks project, what was really exciting for me is Nick, who was in that video, was my PhD student, and he did his PhD on how do communities make choices about their livelihoods and what's the scenarios in which they're going to shift from one activity to another. And basically, it comes down to risk and it comes down to economic state. So if you're extremely poor already, you're not going to take very many risks and you can't invest to change your lot. And the biggest thing that people lacked was any kind of financial security or savings at all, and any kind of insurance scheme. So if anybody in their family gets sick, they can't do anything about it. So rather than looking at it in a time, so I think the time response relates to the ecological response, which is one piece of research. The other thing is what is the socioeconomic environment that's going to engage. So one of the latest work we're doing as part of that community banking scheme is integrating an environmental management savings component into that community banking scheme, which will help them manage their own resources. So the intent is there. So it's basically, it's a case of reducing vulnerability and risk to the point that people will actively engage in a marine resource management for the future. What amazes me from looking in the UK context is how much people will do already in that situation of desperation. And I think part of it is because there's nothing, it's one of hopefulness, of being in a very desperate situation, so really feeling that they must act and must do something now to give any hope for the future. There's no social security system, there's no backup mechanism. If they don't act, there's no government who's going to come in and sort of provide them with a benefit system. So in that situation, I'm always stunned in terms of how actively engaged communities are in marine conservation. And that's because they understand it. And often all we're doing is catalyzing and training and empowering that change that is already wanted, but it's more the capacity to do it which is missing. So it's all done by the communities. We're facilitators in the process.
So do you think that positive stories get more widespread use coverage than negative stories, and similarly for social media, do positive feel-good stories get shared more on Facebook or Twitter or what the negative stories will?
Yes. There's fewer of them, but they have greater traction and they have more sharing, and there's a paper on that. So. Oh, God. I'll have to, let me not assume. I will look it up. I knew I was going to get busted sooner or later. Thank you. No, this is success would be extinction.
Yeah. So is this being used more as a sort of kick-starting gathering of both building of community fabric and also getting some sort of economic savings cushion so that the community has something that then they can start something else? Is that in brain, or is this just a company looking for, excuse me if I sound a little cynical,
Yeah.
just a company looking for a cheap way of getting some prime material, and as soon as it's gone there, they just go to Cameroon and start buying it there?
Yeah. It's a good question. There's a couple of things. So the volume of fishing nets going into the environment every year is massive, and nylon 6 lasts for 600 years in the environment. So there is a lot of cleaning up to do before we run out of nets. And we were completely stunned when we piloted this project and did a scoping research project for 3 months at the beginning, just to answer that question, or at least give an indication of that question. So the most productive net fishery is for crabs, because crabs very quickly damage the nets and they become not usable. One very poor fisherman in the Philippines has on average, one crab fisherman has on average 25 kilometers of net on the go at any one time, and he's replacing that every 1 to 3 months. What we are seeing, so it's a lot of net, what the change we've seen, which is, so we anticipated we would get a peak and then it would drop off to some level. And I should say that there's, by June, we'll have a report, because we've been tracking both doing transects and monitoring waste sites and collecting socioeconomic data alongside this program, we haven't seen the drop-off. What we have seen in terms of change is at the end of life, the nets feed straight into the recycling model rather than the throwing away stage, which is what we're all looking for around marine debris, is stop it getting into the environment in the first place. And you can actually see that with the shipments, is that there's a lot more shiny white nets versus the really old ones. But there's a lot, one of the community benefits is anybody can collect nets. You know, it's not something that you need any equipment for, you just need some time. So people are picking it out of the sand where it's often sort of buried and cleaning it up. And it just depends how motivated you are, how much time and how much you need that money. So I do think there will be sites, and I think our situation in Cameroon is more the latter that you described, that we will set up the infrastructure, collect the nets, and we don't know if there's a sustainable business model in there. One of the things in the business model is determining how many communities you need to feed into the collection model to make it work financially, and how that changes over time, and how you keep communities motivated to keep collecting nets, and what the dynamics are, and all the variables in business models, from fuel costs and that competitors. So the competitor here is furniture stuffers. So you know, there's sort of all of those dynamics that we're sort of understanding from the business perspective. That was the reason we could have just set up let's go and collect nets and do a nice shiny film. We did the shiny film as well. But we could just go and collect nets and have a bunch of entrepreneurs go and do that. And that's why we took the time to identify a sustainable community, the community banking system, because if the worst comes to the worst, that has established one of the key gaps in those communities, which is access to savings and credits without being ripped off by some helpful financial entrepreneur who's charging ridiculous interest rates, keeping money in the community. And we've had examples. There was, one guy said, I'd love to join the savings group, but I don't have enough money, I don't have any money to save. Whereupon our community organizer pointed out that he enjoyed his bottle of rum every week. And maybe if he looked at giving that up or reducing the amount of rum he drank, he would be able to join. And he did. And he's now a very active savings member. So, and probably is back on the rum again as well. But, this is very, it's a really amazing insight for me in conservation. It's just like, but this is the point of looking in other areas that are working in these things already. Is just like, it was just sitting there. But in that development community banking model, there's no caring about how they spend their money. They could be using it to buy dynamite, to go dynamite fishing, or they could be using, so that what we're trying to do is add that environmental lens and filter and opportunity there through using an established, very robust system developed by somebody else.
Rome is a great segue to beer, but we'll take one more question and then we'll head out of the room.
I thought one of the really interesting parts of your talk was discussing these larger catastrophic natural events, but the events that are becoming more frequent with climate change, things like storms. It seems like diversity and intact habitats are really good upgrades for those things. But I was wondering what your thoughts are on conservation strategies, especially because both ecosystems and human communities who suffer the highest impacts are not first world countries that are high contributors for greenhouse gas. So just how do you approach this problem on a global scale, and then how do you connect those human communities in these areas that are most likely?
And world peace, or it's a good question, and it was a very, we tend to talk about in the future, it's all climate models in the future, and this is a right here, right now scenario for the team, and it's really shifted. Our entire program is now about how can we build social and environmental resilience. One of the very interesting things, we did a joint project, or just finishing up a joint project with Oxfam, is the development agencies have these disaster protocols. They go in there and they're hitting the health, and they're hitting the water, and they're hitting the shelter, and they're hitting the sanitation, and then they start bumbling around doing environmental stuff. Sorry if anybody works in that, but they've got these guidelines on cash for work schemes, and how to get the infrastructure going, and how they work with local governments, even if they've no experience in working there. I think there's a huge opportunity to look at how we connect environmental resilience and environmental responses to that. So we've all seen data from previous studies, and it's happened again in the Philippines in certain sites, is re-equipping fishers with bigger boats with bigger engines as a disaster response, well-meaning, but there's no fish to catch in some of these sites, and then you've just upped your fishing pressure as the well-meaning disaster response. And that was some of the tough decisions that conversations we were having as we were trying to help people, is kind of that immediate urge to help, and just the discipline of, we did some focus group discussions, and the team were like, we're trying to get them food, and it was just like, but this is going to inform what we do for the future. And so adding that onto it was really important. And I think there's a great opportunity to add more entrenched environmental guidelines into work with the development organizations that at the moment run a bit in parallel. In terms of the climate change, I think I've certainly seen the island nations are having a much stronger political voice, or working much more in unity, because they are ocean people and they are on the front line of the issues facing climate change. I don't have all the answers, but I think it is a mixture of maximizing resilience, looking at reinstating green belts, looking at how communities live. There's already one of the earthquake islands has dropped by a meter, so it floods every high tide. So that community isn't viable. So the government's now looking at evacuating that entire community, but what's their livelihoods going to be, and where are they going to go? So there's a lot of planning that has to be done to dealing with these most vulnerable communities, and thinking about So rebuilds are work where the in one town where the government office used to be, it's now a McDonald's in the lowland, and the church and school and government buildings are in the highlands. So no comment on the strategy there, but I think it is a shift in looking at how to reduce vulnerability through disaster risk reduction training. What was really interesting is you probably didn't hear about Typhoon Ruby and Shenyang that hit December 2014. That was the largest peacetime evacuation of people. 1 million people were moved in the Philippines. 32 people died. It was a very big typhoon. People were prepared, and we've got lots of local stories from the communities we work in. Is they knew what to do, they acted, and they were able to survive. So there's that's a very frontline response that's terrifying in the long term, but it's got to be that mix of actions, I think.